We'd been on the road for hours, and Scott, our ever-confident driver, was grinning at the map on his phone. "We're almost there, guys," he said, as though the words alone would make the twisting road easier to handle. His voice was the kind that made you believe everything was going to be okay, even when it wasn't. But it wasn't okay. The road was growing rougher, and I could feel the Jeep struggling to stay on course, the tires slipping on loose gravel. The trees loomed above us like giants, their thick branches blocking out the light, casting everything into shadows. The air felt colder too, and the farther we went, the more the trees seemed to close in, suffocating us. The heat in the car was oppressive, and I was starting to feel trapped. Scott looked back at us. "Just a little bit farther," he said. His eyes didn't hold the same certainty this time. Carly leaned over from the back seat, her voice laced with anxiety. "Maybe we should have taken the longer route. I don't like this." "Don't be a baby," Francine teased her. But the words felt hollow in the air. Even Francine, usually the most carefree of us, was on edge. Suddenly, the Jeep lurched. The front tires hit something and the car came to a halt with a violent jerk. Scott slammed his foot on the brake, his eyes wide with confusion and panic. What the hell was that? He got out of the Jeep and we followed him, stepping out into the cold, biting air. The wind howled through the trees like something alive, and the forest felt wrong. Barbed wire. It stretched across the road, hidden by the undergrowth, like a trap waiting to be sprung. It was old, rusted, but sharp enough to tear through the Jeep's tires. The thick layer of leaves that had covered it had concealed the wire well enough that Scott hadn't seen it coming. "This is insane," Jesse murmured. "Who would do something like this?" Scott cursed under his breath, kicking at the wire in frustration. "It's just a stupid fence. I'll fix this. We can back up and turn around." But the Jeep wouldn't budge. The tires were caught, trapped in the wire's web. "We're stuck," Carly said, her voice trembling. It was getting darker, and Scott's calm exterior was beginning to crack. "We'll walk," he finally said. "I'll call for help once we're out of the woods." None of us were happy about it, but there was nothing else we could do. We grabbed what we could from the Jeep: flashlights, water bottles, a pocket knife, and started walking down the road. The farther we went, the more claustrophobic the forest became. The trees were so dense, their gnarled branches reaching out like claws. The air was colder now, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. My flashlight flickered, and I tightened my grip on it. "I don't like this," Carly muttered under her breath. She was walking faster now, clearly uncomfortable. I know," I whispered back. I had the same feeling in my gut, the kind that told you something wasn't right, but I didn't want to voice it. I didn't want to seem paranoid. Then, out of nowhere, we saw it. The cabin. It looked like something out of a nightmare, crooked and decaying. The wood darkened by years of neglect. The windows were either shattered or boarded up, and the chimney curled a thin trail of smoke into the cold air. It was isolated, tucked deep into the woods, and there was something about it that made my skin crawl. "Maybe we can find help here," Scott said, his voice forced. "No way," Jesse protested. "We're not going inside that place." But it was too late. Scott had already started toward the door, and despite our protests, we followed him. The inside was worse than I could have imagined. The air was thick with rot, and the floorboards creaked under our feet as we stepped inside. The walls were lined with strange old tools, rusted hooks, knives, axes, and chains, all stained with what I hoped was just rust. The ceiling was decorated with what I could only assume were animal bones, strung together in twisted mobiles that spun in the breeze. But it wasn't the bones that made my stomach churn, it was the smell. A sickly, rancid odor that made me want to vomit. "This is insane," Carly said, her voice shaking as she covered her nose. But before any of us could respond, there was a noise, a creak. The door swung open behind us, and that's when we saw them. 3 figures stood in the doorway, their faces twisted and malformed. At first, I thought they were wearing masks, but as they moved closer, I saw the truth. These weren't masks. These were people, but they weren't like any people I'd ever seen. One of them had a grotesque, misshapen forehead. The skin stretched taut across his skull. His eyes were milky white, and his teeth, God, his teeth were too sharp, too long, like something out of a horror movie. The second had skin that looked like it had been burned, his face a mass of scars. His eyes were wide and unblinking, staring straight through us. The third was the largest, towering over us like some kind of monstrous creature. His back was hunched, his movements jerky and unnatural. His hands were calloused and gnarled, and his breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. The silence between us was broken by a low, guttural growl. The first one stepped forward, his mouth pulling into a twisted grin. "We've been waiting for you," he said. I froze. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Then it happened in an instant. The second figure lunged at Scott, grabbing him by the throat and slamming him into the wall. The sound of cracking bones was sickening. I screamed, but the scream was cut short as the third figure grabbed me by the arm, yanking me toward the butcher's block. I fought, kicking and punching, but it was no use. I was too weak. Francine pushed past me, grabbing a knife from the counter and swinging it at the hulking figure. But it didn't do any good. With a single swipe, the monster knocked her across the room, her body hitting the wall with a sickening thud. Jesse screamed, but the second figure was on her in a heartbeat, sinking his teeth into her neck. The sound was like tearing cloth, and Jesse's screams turned into gurgles. I wanted to run, but my legs were frozen, my mind in complete shock. But there was one chance. The fire tower. We'd seen it in the distance when we first arrived. If we could make it there, we could get high enough to get away. I didn't wait for anyone else. I grabbed Carly's hand and we ran. The climb was brutal, the metal stairs cold beneath our hands and feet. I could hear the monsters below, their growls and shuffling footsteps growing louder. When we reached the top, we could see them, crawling toward us, their twisted figures illuminated by the full moon. But we were too high for them to reach, for now. We stayed there for what felt like hours, the monsters circling below like vultures. Every time we thought it was safe, we heard the faint crack of branches, a noise that made my heart race. But it was Scott who made the sacrifice. He descended the tower, shouting to distract them, buying us time. We watched as he ran into the woods, the creatures chasing him. We never saw him again. Finally, when we could no longer hear the creatures, we climbed down and ran. We found an old junkyard, and it was there that we managed to hotwire an old truck. We didn't stop driving until we found a highway and flagged down a passing truck. The police didn't believe us. They searched the area but found nothing. No cabin, no bodies, nothing. But I know what we saw, and I know what they are. They're still out there, waiting for the next group to take the same shortcut. And I don't think we're the last ones.